I covered the Fukushima nuclear power plant. And I just couldn't believe it, why it burned up. Well, I can't design a nuclear reactor, but I wouldn't put my emergency cooling pump and its electric motor in a non-waterproof basement when I live next to the sea. And if they'd put in waterproof doors, it would not have happened. Simple, old-fashioned waterproof doors. You see, I just see that. The mathematicians did a great job of making it earthquake-proof, but they didn't see the water coming in and flooding it.
Well, it's nice to meet you, Temple. Thank you for joining us.
Well, it's great to be here.
When we're designing a cattle plant, I can see the visual thing really helps you visualize what would be a more effective way to do it. When you think about cybersecurity, it strikes me as more intangible. It's hard for me to imagine what are the ways that the problem can be improved.
Well, I think the most important thing, cybersecurity, is we have to protect critical infrastructure, power plant equipment, water distribution equipment against the computer. I'm going to figure it will be hacked, and you have these things called programmable logic controllers. And they're small computers that operate industrial equipment. They need to be completely isolated from the internet. Completely. Let's say I got a PLC controller and I have a pressure vessel, and the PLC is controlling how hot it gets. If the PLC keeps telling the heating element to keep heating and heating and heating, where it would destroy the piece of equipment, it needs to shut down. And I'll tell you, the PLCs are very, very hackable. The other thing I would do is, there was a very bad situation I wrote about in the book where the manager of a waterworks was looking at his computer and the mouse arrow was just moving all around. And it clicked on a link that would dump a tank of chemicals very quickly into the water, which would be bad. But you know what stopped it? If the pipe is only this big around, it's going to dump it really slowly. That's a mechanical control. I want to use old-fashioned mechanical controls to protect infrastructure. So if something has too much pressure, old-fashioned gauge will shut it off. I've got to protect the infrastructure. It's very expensive to replace. Also, when it malfunctions, like an oil refinery, for example, that can be very dangerous. I want to protect it. Spins too fast, shut down. Too much pressure, shut down. Gets too hot, shut down. I've got to protect infrastructure. Like on some of the power distribution equipment, I was at an engineering meeting I was invited to where people that maintain power distribution equipment. I went right up to the salesman of some of the major equipment. I said, what's the delivery time on some of that big stuff? 1 year. And I'm being vague. I'm not describing equipment. I don't want to put ideas into people's heads. But certain critical components of getting electricity, it would take me 1 year to get that thing. And I've got to make sure the power plant itself is protected. Old-fashioned electromechanical controls. I have to protect the physical infrastructure. Then let's look at one of our big meat companies got hacked. It was a ransomware attack. And it totally messed up their truck scheduling, both coming in and going out, and it messed up their labeling. It also did a really weird thing, is if an employee of this company, they had Apple iPhones, if they had the company's email address on their phone, it erased their entire contact list on their personal phone. I talked to 3 employees where that happened. That's not very nice, but I've got to make sure that very expensive stuff doesn't get broken or damaged or do something dangerous. And I'm going to look at it like, okay, we have an electric train at the airport. That should not be connected to the internet. Period. That makes it hacker-proof if it's not connected to the internet. And if you connect it to the internet, you need to get fired. And that thing goes fast enough that if you smash 2 of those together, I don't want to be in the front car. Let's put it that way. Yeah, and if the train shuts off, you're really in a mess there. And then you have to look at the phishing attacks and things like that. Our university is concerned because today I'm going to have to do a computer training on cybersecurity. Well, I'm very good at finding the phishing attacks. I had a phishing attack where had an RU at the end of the email address. I said, that's phishing.
Yeah. Even I would have caught that one.
My default setting is scam until proven otherwise. I can't believe the fake Medicaid stuff, the fake PayPal stuff, Amazon account, fake stuff that I get.
You know, we've been doing some work on the problem of cybersecurity, and they talk a lot about, these different pillars. And you just already talked about water, transportation, when we think about the airport, the kind of where we're vulnerable. There's a couple of other sectors, the finance industry. How do we spot the vulnerabilities? Because we have to help the public understand as well that these pillars of our society really are vulnerable.
What exactly are the pillars? Well, power, water. I just say I'm very old-fashioned. All my contacts are I've got them written down in paper. Let's look at self-driving cars, and somebody hacks it and then tells the cars to hit each other. See, this is where you're going to have something in there where you have a lidar detector or some other device that it will stop with the system that's not connected to the internet.
Right. And so what we don't have right now in our society are these checks and balances. So with you and people like you that can go in there as they're thinking, they have them in Los Angeles where I live now, all over the place, these self-driving cars. And I think about it every time I see one. If some hacker gets in there, the damage, right? So when we're putting these new ideas into our culture, how do we ensure that we have your thinking, this kind of thinking that you're talking about?
Well, you see, this is something that worries me because it's very different than mathematical thinking. And, you watch the movie Space Odyssey, Hal has to have an off switch.
Yes.
And I think the car needs to have you disconnect all computer stuff and you should still be able to brake and steer.
Does this weigh on you? I mean, your ability to spot all of these sort of potential disasters all the time, how do you live with that emotionally?
Well, hopefully it won't happen, but I'm concerned. I'll be thinking about things where, all right, let's look at that Korean airplane crash. Why is there a concrete wall there, you idiots? That pilot did a perfect gearless, flapless belly landing. And if there hadn't been a concrete wall at the end of the runway, there's no way I would have put a concrete wall at the end of the runway. No way.
Right.
The pilot was a genius in what he did, but concrete wall killed everybody except the two flight attendants sitting in the jump seat in the back because the tail stayed intact. And I see it. I know exactly where they sit on that seat. And as I talk about it, I see it. Then I'm seeing now the runaway truck things. You drive through the country, it's hilly, and there's these runaway truck ramps. They have similar things for planes where there'll be a lot of deep gravel and something that, to slow the plane down. And I've seen trucks drive into those runaway truck ramps, and they work. You get about halfway up there, truck's mired down in the gravel. The driver's standing outside his cab. He's on a cell phone.
You refer to yourself as being diagnosed with autism. I'm sure you get emails or fan mails. People say they've just been diagnosed with autism. What do you say? What do you say to them?
Well, most of them find it a relief. I do have a book called Different, Not Less. Different, Not Less.
Yes.
It's 18 people diagnosed later in life describing their experiences. And most people later in life, they find it's a relief. It explains a lot of their social problems. And most of these people in Different, Not Less have got jobs. They learned job skills young. They were doing things like selling newspapers when they were young. And I know we don't have paper routes anymore, but we need to be making substitutes for that, like church volunteer jobs or selling candy for charity. It's just something I did, which got me used to going up and talking to people.
We're talking about chapter 6 and visual thinkers, how they can contribute to other kinds of projects. Do you feel like they're excluded from projects at the moment?
I'm very concerned about the school system screening out the object visualizers, the people like me, because we can't do algebra. And some people say, well, you have to have algebra to have logical thinking. Well, that's not how I think. I will just see how something works. And I'm very concerned that we're getting screened out, and you're going to need us visual thinkers. I spent 25 years in heavy construction supervising installation of equipment that I had designed. And there were many people that owned metal fabrication shops that invented mechanical devices that can't do algebra. And I think one of the worst things the schools have done is taking out all the hands-on shop classes because the people I worked with are retiring out. I'm 77 now. So people are retiring out and they're not getting replaced. And let's just talk a little bit about the different kinds of thinkers, because in my book, Visual Thinking, right here, the first chapter discusses the different kinds of thinking. And I tell a lot of business people, you have to realize this exists. I'm an object visualizer. So my memory is like little phone pictures. And object visualizers are very good with mechanical, animals, because animals live in a sensory-based world, photography and art, and terrible at algebra. Then you have the visual, spatial, mathematical pattern, music, and math mind, thinking in patterns. And the research, and there's a lot of references in the visual thinking book, they're very different kinds of thinking. And then, of course, you've got thinking in words. So your first step is you have to realize different kinds of thinking exist. And you were talking about chapter 6, that's my disaster chapter.
Yes.
And I covered the Fukushima nuclear power plant. And I just couldn't believe it, why it burned up. Well, I can't design a nuclear reactor, but I wouldn't put my emergency cooling pump and its electric motor in a non-waterproof basement when I live next to the sea. And if they'd put in waterproof doors, it would not have happened.
Right.
Simple, old-fashioned waterproof doors. You see, I just see that. The mathematicians did a great job of making it earthquake-proof, but they didn't see the water coming in and flooding it.
How do we get people to think about that? Because that just seems like a very obvious thing.
But you see, it's only obvious to the visual thinker. What I've learned about the mathematician, they don't see the water coming over the seawall. They had a 10-meter seawall. It took me 20 minutes on Google to look at historical data. The seawall would be breached. They would have had that data. And what do you think is going to happen? I can see the water coming out of the seawall. It's really going to be a problem because it will prevent the water from leaving the site. So now I've got a 20-foot puddle of water that's guaranteed to break out the doors. And what's going to happen to the electric pump?
Right.
Do we see those same problems in other industries?
Oh,
Like, do
yeah,
you see that?
absolutely you do. Absolutely you do.
Do you see that in agriculture? Like,
Oh,
where do
any
you see those?
industry, but we have to, elevator has to work. It does not need to be connected to the internet. It can't be hacked. There's no way to hack it if it's not connected to the internet.
If you were to redesign the way we think about problems like Fukushima, why wouldn't there be a visual thinker in the system? How would we redesign the system so it would be more accommodating?
I've talked to a lot of business people, all kinds of business people, hands-on engineering companies, travel companies, just all kinds of things. And I remember telling the CEO of one of the travel websites, the first step is you have to realize different kinds of thinking exist. And a lot of people don't realize that different kinds of thinking exists. And the people that are pushing the algebra don't recognize what the visual thinker does. But I worked out in industry. I mean, just the other day on my center track restrainer system, was a piece of equipment I supervised installation. Oh, the maintenance department put the coolest switch on there. And it's for stopping and starting the cattle restrainer. It works just great. Super simple, done with a limit switch, but you got to put the limit switch in there right. Otherwise, it will break. And that is visual thinking. I just saw that just the other day. And as I travel around, I'm seeing elevators that are not being fixed, escalators that are not being fixed. We need these people to fix things. Things aren't getting fixed. We've had broken elevators at the Denver airport now for months and months and months now.
What does a limit switch do?
Well, a limit switch basically has a little box with a feeler that sticks out. And they're used on a lot of equipment where, like, say, a door, for example, gets to a certain point, it will stop it. Well, he put a hinged metal plate and the person can push their knee on and put the limit switch in behind it on an angle. And so if you push on that plate, the restrainer will stop. If you let go, it works great. And it's so simple, and the limit switch is not going to break. And it's a standard off-the-shelf industrial item. Every factory has tons of these limit switch things. And somebody just made that in a shop.
When you first saw it, were you surprised?
I go, wow. But then we went on break. I got a chance to try it. And it was amazing how well it worked. And it was so cheap and inexpensive to make. But that's a shop person. Shop person just made it.
You've done extraordinary contributions to our world. You've changed the world. How do we break the stigma?
Well, the first thing I think we need to do is I always work to prove that I could do really good work. When I did my first projects, those dipping vats that are shown in the HBO movie Temple Grandin shows how I think visually. I wanted to prove to the world I wasn't stupid.
Right.
And I think we need to be showing off the work. I worked with autistic metal workers. Okay, I talked about the center track restrainer system. You look that up in Beef Plant Video Tour with Temple Grandin. And the shop that worked on that originally, the guy was undiagnosed autistic. I've worked with maintenance people, have a little shop inside a plant, and they could build anything. They're all retiring out now, and they were definitely on the autism spectrum. He was just a weird guy in the shop, but if it was electrical, he could make it. And we got to be showing what these people could do. Half of Silicon Valley programmers are on the spectrum. I've been to those companies. They don't like to talk about being on the spectrum. I talked to a guy who retired from NASA in Houston, and he says, oh, half those engineers were on the spectrum. I make it very clear, we need those skills. We have the mathematical kind of autistic, but you also have the visual thinking autistic.
And that it's not a negative, that it's just part of the human condition, right? We need these different perspectives.
Well, you see, in autism, the other problem you got is you're going all the way from somebody who can't dress themselves to Einstein, who had no speech until age 3, who would definitely land in an autism program today, very definitely. And we need the skills of these people. But I think one of the worst things the schools have done is taken out the shop classes, so the kid never has a chance to discover that they might have good skills in building things and mechanical things.
In the end, this word autism, is it just a label? Isn't it just really a form of being human?
Well, I think in the milder versions, it's just a personality variant. When does geeks and nerds get an autism label? But then we go down to the individuals that don't speak and individuals that may have difficulty walking and motor problems, they can't dress themselves. That's also given the same label. So one of the big problems you have with service providers is you're dealing with one individual that needs to be taking a shop class, or you have a third grader who's not being challenged in math. This is another problem. We are not developing our little math kids. And that little third grader may need high school algebra. He's going to just take off with that. And if we want to beat China, we better develop our math kids, and we're not doing it. And it takes the visual thinker who can't do math to realize we need to develop math kids. There's sort of a thing in the schools where they think everybody's the same, and they're not.
Right.
Now, there's conversations around using AI to help kids stay at their level. And I know in the book also, there's a lot of controversy, which you talk about. But with regards to just this point, do we think that artificial intelligence could help that third grader who really needs to be doing college level math?
Get up Khan Academy, which is free, or some other math class that's online, and use that. And then have a high school teacher help them some. Math kids turn into bad behavior problems when their skills aren't developed. I was at a school recently that was right next to a brand new data center that had just been put in. And they had some little math geniuses. I said, drive them around that data center. They won't let you go in there. You can show pictures online of what it looks like inside, but take them over where the electric power comes in. You've got enough power going in there to run a small city. And say to the math kid, let's design computers inside there that will take half the power. That's the sort of things I'd like to get little math kids obsessed with.
Yeah.
But you got to show them stuff, and then I'd show them pictures on the computer what the data centers look like inside, and those are easy to find online. It's just rack after rack, thousands and thousands of computers are in there, eating up electricity.
You have a very specific methodology around your design. Do you think there's future technologies that haven't been invented that this design thinking would be really applicable for?
Well, this thing is where I'm pretty sure that artificial intelligence could know the rules of layout cattle handling facilities. I'm pretty sure it could, but you still need somebody to check things, because if the database is wrong, then it hallucinates. Yesterday, we had a big meeting where the faculty could get together and see what the experiment station was doing. And they showed this map of the state of Colorado of all these sensing devices that different agencies have for sensing soil moisture. That's how you determine drought. And I'll look at this map, and you got 5 different vendors of equipment on there. I'm going, well, you want a good job for the freshmen? I'd like to go around about 10% of those and take some really sophisticated equipment. I want to find out how accurate those sensors are before I feed that into an AI system. And the different types of equipment, is it maintained? I just looked at this map, and I had like 100 sensor locations, probably 5 different agencies doing it. I want to get some idea. Do they maintain the stuff? Are they accurate? If I take a sample 5 feet away from it, is it accurate? Is the equipment broken? Because on AI, I don't understand the computer stuff, but I've reviewed AI papers. I get all over the message section. I remember one paper, they said they analyzed the behavior of the dairy cows, but they didn't tell me how they collected the data on the behavior of the dairy cows. How did you collect the behavior information on these dairy cows? I need to know. And you need to write it in the paper. And you didn't tell me, did you scan sample it? Was it continuous observation? If it was a scan sample, was it every 5 minutes? Or was it every hour? You got to tell me what you did. And AI is only as good as the training data set.
And that's a very common problem. Do you see that often in a lot of the things that you look at?
Oh, yeah, I can't believe some of the method sections of papers. You look at a genetics paper and, well, they don't tell me how they picked their animal populations. So you're comparing the genetics of this animals against these animals. And this is real recent, so I've got to be a little vague as confidentiality issues. But you got to tell me, where'd you get these animals from? You have two populations. You got two populations of animals. You're going to compare all this genomic stuff. I've got to know where they came from. The other thing I'm finding, and I reviewed a lot of papers, well, on a meat quality experiment, for example, they didn't tell me what they fed their animal. That's going to affect meat quality. Or they'll say, we house some pigs to EU specifications. Well, what is that? What is it? How'd you house them? Those pigs. How'd you house them? Tell me what you had them in.
What fields do you think would be most interesting to actually work in?
Well, there's a lot of stuff that, is interesting to work in. Right now, the tech companies are hiring AI people. The video game industry just laid off a whole ton of people. You've got a lot of autistic people who want to go into video game design. Middle managers are getting laid off. And one of the big problems is you have the corporate people. If they never get out in the field, the verbal thinkers are going to make decisions about stuff that are very vague and bad. All right, like one company decided to lay off all the assistant warehouse managers just across the whole company. I can't say what it is, what the company is, or what the warehouses have in them, but it was a mess. I can't go into details because it gets confidential. But that decision was probably made by somebody who had never been out in the field.
Mm-hmm.
The suits are going to get out of the office. There's a tendency of verbal thinking to get too vague, to get way too vague. All right, let's talk about accommodations for autistic students. Well, yes, but let's talk about the specific accommodations that are actually really important. And on the architecture, I want to get rid of the LED lights that flicker. That's going to be a problem for 10, 20%. Written pilot's checklist format for tasks involving sequence is another one, and extra time on tests. But these are three specific things that have come up over and over again. In food safety, we call those critical control points because they are some of the most important stuff. But you see, those are specific things that a school could actually do rather than talking about accommodations in some vague way.
We talk about some of the things that we say of autistic people. You talked about the spectrum and the range of people on the spectrum. Isn't the person who runs the plant, the suits, so to speak, don't they have their own set of biases that they don't see, their own sense of blindness?
There's all kinds of different kinds of plant managers. I've worked for a whole of them. And a really good operations person that actually runs a great plant. One thing I've learned, they better not mess around in the futures market. They're going to get burned. I don't understand that cattle futures market. I wouldn't touch it. I've seen super good operations managers lose their feed yard messing around in the futures market. You see, this is where the mathematician needs to handle that. The visual thinkers are often very good at actually running a really good plant. Okay, let's just food processing plant, really clean, doing everything really right. And the guy who has to go to the futures market has a mess of a feed yard. You see, this is where we have to start looking at complementary skills. For example, when I did visual thinking, I'm kind of disorganized because I'm an associative thinker, but Betsy Lerner, my co-author, verbal thinker, she smoothed it all out. So that's different minds working together. We're building a food processing plant. The visual thinkers invent the mechanical devices, but I need the degree-trained engineer for refrigeration and make sure the building doesn't fall apart. You see, there's the part of this that needs the math, and then there's the mechanical parts, like this switch on my restrainer. This thing is so clever. Kicking myself, I didn't think it up. But you got to get that limit switch in there just the right angle, otherwise it won't work.
Temple, you talk a lot about thinking in images. And years ago when you were designing kind of the sort of these protocols for the cattle, can you just describe that process? Because I'm the opposite. I'm definitely the verbal. I'm a verbal thinker.
Well, if I think about, all right, let me just ask you, this is a question I've asked to a lot of people. Think about a church steeple. How does it come into your mind? And I purposely don't ask you to think about house or dog because you're too familiar with that. Or we now could do cell phone tower, but I started doing this before cell phone towers were around. And the visual thinker will start naming off the churches. I've had verbal thinkers that just will give you let me just draw you on this paper right here. Just lines like that. just lines. The verbal thinker just gets 2 lines. And then there's people that are mixtures, and they'll kind of describe kind of a pretty detailed New England steeple or something like that, but they don't tell you where it's located. The visual thinker, I just start naming them off. But I'm also seeing a church that just has a stainless steel cross for a steeple that I pass every time I go to the airport.
When you asked me that question, I literally saw what you just showed me. That's what I saw, those 2 lines.
You just saw the 2
Yes,
lines.
that
I
was it.
use paper. That's why you're seeing print through that.
What did you see, Jesse, in your mind?
I mean, I saw a steeple in a little town, I'm from in Minnesota.
That's more visual. It's specific because you're naming a specific one. That's more visual.
Yeah.
And the reason why I asked church steeple, or now I could also ask cell phone tower, is these things are out there in the environment and most people don't pay that much attention to them. You don't own them. So I'm deliberately not asking you dog, house, or car, because most people can visualize stuff in their own house. You see, nothing's abstract for me. Going back to the accommodations for the autistic students, I can see, okay, we have a chemistry experiment, and they see like a checklist format where you have the steps for the chemistry experiment, because I have problems with remembering sequence. I need that external working memory of a pilot's checklist. And that's a very simple accommodation. Save a lot of jobs too. Okay, I got to do espressos at Starbucks. Let me make a checklist of how to do some of these different drinks. And then eventually, when I learn it, I can get rid of that. But I need that in the beginning.
Your methodology, the way you see the world, can that be imparted in a checklist?
Yeah, when I worked in a dairy as a graduate student in a school farm, they had a checklist on the wall on how to clean the milking equipment. It had about 7 or 8 steps in it. Because if you do it wrong, you might run soapy water into the bulk tank and ruin a bulk tank of milk. It's not going to make you very popular if you do that. But that checklist was really, really helpful to me. But I think the first step is people have to realize different thinking exists. And that's why I did, and this is my young readers version of different kinds of minds. And then this is the regular version of visual thinking. This is the reason why these books were done, because I'm very concerned about losing our object visualizers. And we need their skills.
Temple, when you first started the things you wanted to work on, was it hard to get the plant owner to understand your ideas, and how did that process go?
Well, one of the things I had to do with a plant owner is discuss it from an economic standpoint. I can reduce labor. I can take out one person. Boy, that gets them interested real fast. I can reduce damage on the cattle. I can improve employee safety. I had to sell it strictly on the economics. But the other thing I did when I first designed projects is I wrote about them. And I was a livestock editor for our state farm magazine. And that really helped my career, because I would design something and then write about it. When I did a corral system years ago in Oregon, I wrote about it in Oregon State Farm magazine. And I'd put drawings in there. And the way I used to sell jobs, once I had projects designed, is I'd show people pictures of my jobs. I'd show them copies of my drawings. Like, for example, this right here is one of my drawings. This is in the young readers version of visual thinking. It's called Different Kinds of Minds. It's the young readers version, the same book. And I would simply take fold-out drawings and just show them. I designed the front end of a lot of Cargill plants. I sent Cargill back in the late 80s, big fold-out drawing, plastic pages with some pictures in it. Basically, I learned to sell my work by just showing off my work. That's what I did.
But how'd you get in the door? Because that's a long time ago.
Being a livestock editor. And then I started writing for national cattle magazines. Oh, free advertising. The press pass helped a whole lot. And being a woman was a much bigger barrier. Autism was a non-issue in the 70s. But women were in journalism. And that really helped me. But I wrote about things. When we did those dip fats that were shown in the movie, I wrote about them in Beef Magazine. And then I got some other jobs from that.
So you're a visual thinker, but you also work with words.
Well, I'm very good at writing how-to directions. Okay, how to build something. As I write, I'm seeing the things I'm writing about. If I'm writing about animal behavior, I'm seeing the cattle or the dog, whatever, when I write about it. The words narrate the pictures. And then later on, I wrote the guidelines for the American Meat Institute on animal welfare. Very, very simple scoring system for evaluating humane handling in slaughter plants. Worked really well, and I taught McDonald's, Burger King, and Wendy's how to use it.
Yeah. What do you see in your students? Are they intelligent? Are they learning the things you're talking about?
Well, I'm very concerned about, kids don't tinker anymore with mechanical things. We've got kids growing up today that have never used a tool. I had a student in my class, and they have to do a scale drawing in my class. They have never used a ruler to measure something. They're growing up totally removed from the world of the practical. And this very much concerns me, because these are people who are going to have to make decisions about things in the future. And I've talked to other faculty about this, especially since COVID. And I think one of the worst things schools have done is taken out hands-on classes, because I think they teach a kind of practical problem solving. See, now we're going to have people up in management that do something like you lay off all your assistant warehouse managers just across your whole company. That wasn't a very smart thing to do. That actually happened. I can't tell you whose company it was.
Did they end up hiring them all back, or did they
I don't
have
know.
to start again?
This is something that just happened, but it was a mess. The people that made that decision had no idea of what was going on out in the field. I always say the suits have got to get out of the office.
If we've got these visual thinkers, little kids, and most of their time is, like you said, on the computer playing video games, you talk about that in the book, are they getting enough visual references from the real world? Or are their references only what they're being fed?
Well, they're not getting enough because let's go back to designing the corrals. In order to design them, I have to have been out in these places, and I know what the gates look like. That's why it's so important to get out. I went to every feed yard in Arizona, and I worked cattle. And think of all the images I could download. Things that work, things that don't work. And in my book, I explain how I did that. This would have been back in the 70s I did this.
And did you know that you needed the imagery in order to work on the problem?
I didn't know when I was doing it that other people thought in words. I did not know that. I did not know that people thought in words or math until I was in my late 30s, and I'd already designed a whole lot of equipment. Well, I asked a speech therapist about the church steeple, and she just did the 2 lines. And then I described in The Autistic Brain, one of my other books, how I started figuring it out. Then I figured there was another kind, the pattern thinker. And then when I did this book, I think this came out in 2014, The Autistic Brain, that's when I discovered the first research that the object visualizer and the mathematical pattern thinker are really different kinds of thinking. But when I was doing all my original cattle work, which was shown in the HBO movie Temple Grandin, I thought everybody was a visual thinker.
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't figure out why they thought it was weird that I got in the shoot to look at shadows and stuff like that. And then in visual thinking, I talk about aphantasia. I also started finding a few people that don't visualize at all. I remember having dinner with another speech therapist, and I said, can you visualize walking into the university? She was a professor, and going to your office. Can you see your office door? No. But the thing that's weird about aphantasia people is that they often dream in pictures. But there's research now, and I cover it in detail in the visual thinking book, that shows that different kinds of thinking do exist, and there are different approaches to problem solving. Let me give you a simple example of seeing a solution to a problem. All right, I was at the Denver airport. A lady lost her stroller. It was a stroller that held 2 kids. She was annoyed with the airport. And I immediately saw, she can use a Southwest blue wheelchair. Her 2 kids can sit in that. Not the other wheelchairs. They'll fall out of those. Southwest blue wheelchair. And I just immediately saw her kids in the Southwest blue wheelchair. That's a simple example of visual problem solving. And it just comes up like a PowerPoint slide.
Because you have that image.
I haven't seen the wheelchairs. I know both kinds of wheelchairs they have at the Denver airport.
Okay.
So if I hadn't seen those wheelchairs, I wouldn't be able to visualize that.
So do you have a photographic memory? Does everything stay in there?
Well, I have to sort of click the take a picture button.
Okay.
Because I'll tell you, like things where my equipment is, I can remember that really well, but I might not remember the furniture in the conference room because I'm not very interested in that.
You talk about your mom helping you a lot when you were really young, because at that time, not a lot was known. How did she support you? Like, what was the support?
Well, it was always, she took my ability in art and encouraged it. I would just do the same horse head over and over and over again. And she encouraged her, draw the whole horse. Take that interest. I couldn't read. And she taught me out of The Wizard of Oz how to read out loud with phonics. And she's a visual thinker. And also 50s upbringing. Because I have grandparents come up to me all the time that were probably what used to be called Asperger's type, where it's autism with no speech delay. And they all had good jobs. And some of this is 50s upbringing where kids were taught to say please and thank you. Social skills were taught. When kids were 7 and 8 years old, we had to put a good clothes on and be little hosts and hostesses at parents' parties. That taught social skills. That's why I had the guts, and it's shown in the movie, to go up and get that editor's card so I could start writing for the magazine.
Are there specific artists who speak to you? Do you go, I like Picasso or Miles Davis or art or music?
Well, I really like I was just at the Metropolitan Art Museum just recently, and I gave a talk there. We had to walk through the armor room. I was fascinated with the suits of armor and just seeing how those were made. And then we went through the traditional, very realistic sculptures. I tend to like those kinds of things. I've written about Michelangelo, when he was probably autistic, a little grubby 12-year-old dropping out of school. But he grew up with stone cutting tools and he was seeing great art. See, that's exposure. How did I end up in the cattle industry? I got exposed to it as a teenager. Kids today don't get out and do enough stuff to get exposed to enough stuff. A lot of faculty are complaining that, some of the graduate students now, their problem-solving skills are not as good. I've talked to faculty in a number of different places about this.
You're referencing these great artists. Are there other folks that you think about that? Because I think it's about the storytelling and getting the word out. You referenced Michelangelo, maybe had this other way of thinking. Are there other cultural figures, artists, as Jesse was asking, authors?
I think a lot of these. Let's look at Thomas Edison. The Wright brothers were kind of weird. Einstein. The point I want to get across to people is we need these different kinds of thinkers, and we need to work on developing them. How can a kid develop being good with mechanical things if they're not exposed to mechanical things to take apart and tinker with? Kids used to grow up working on cars. They're not doing that now.